Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We are diving deep into a short but surprisingly profound piece of, well, philosophical reflection titled The Turkey Laid the Egg: Identity and Authenticity. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That sounds like maybe the start of a riddle, or possibly a really awful dad joke, and, you're not entirely wrong there. But our mission today is to take this deceptively simple analogy, the turkey and the egg, and really extract the core philosophy the source material uses. It's all about defining what it means to live authentically, what real bravery looks like, and maybe most surprisingly, how all this stuff connects to the volatile and shifting foundations of the technology world.
Yeah, it's quite a framework because it really flips the traditional view on its head, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Usually we define ourselves by our achievements or our job titles, the systems we navigate, but these reflections, they treat identity differently. It's not seen as the result of external things.
Yeah.
It's the fundamental sort of non-negotiable starting point. It's presented as the core being that dictates authentic action, generates true presence, and ultimately that's what delivers the meaningful results, not the other way around.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this setup because it's so memorable. The whole thing pivots on this central question, and the answer is just bang. Why did the turkey lay the egg? And the answer, it wasn't chicken.
Exactly. And the immediate reaction is usually a laugh or maybe a double take, right? But that phrase, it wasn't chicken, it's like the philosophical hammer the writer uses. It just breaks down the concept of identity. It's so concise, and it gets rid of the need for external validation straight away.
I found the next layer even more compelling, actually. The sort of deeper, non-joke explanation for why the turkey laid the egg is just, well, because it is a bird that lays eggs. And then the follow-up, it wasn't chicken, well, because it just wasn't a chicken. It just completely removes any need for an apology or an explanation or some external justification.
Precisely. And that's the definition of a self-validating identity that we find in these notes.
Yeah.
The core message is really the value in being you and owning that. And here's the critical part, I think, that ownership requires no explanation or flashy bit to go along with it. The bird doesn't hold a press conference. It just acts from its nature. Identity, in this view, it's inherent. It doesn't need a spotlight to prove its existence.
That concept right there, identity as just self-validating existence rather than some kind of performed action, that's a complete reframing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests that if you're constantly looking outside yourself for proof or justification, well, maybe you haven't truly accepted your core identity.
Yeah, if you're looking outside, you're performing. That's the idea. But if you're acting from your core, you're simply existing, and the results just follow. And this distinction leads us perfectly into their definition of bravery, which radically challenges what most of us think courage actually is.
It really does, because when we think of bravery, we usually picture that big cinematic moment, don't we? The leap of faith, the dramatic rescue, maybe quitting a job in a blaze of glory, all these moments where people push past their fear or their limits.
Right. And this reflection suggests that while those moments certainly can be courageous, they might actually be performances if they happen outside of a true, sustained internal identity. The source explicitly claims that bravery isn't always a bold move outside of who you are. Think about that for a second. If a person whose core identity is, say, one of quiet consistency, suddenly decides to go bungee jumping just for attention, well, the source suggests that might actually be stress or maybe temporary performance, not necessarily true bravery rooted in their being.
Okay, so if the standard definition of bravery is about overcoming fear by pushing your boundaries, how does this reflection redefine it then?
Well, they define true bravery as existing because of who you are at your core being. It's the courage to maintain your internal truth day in, day out. Even when, every external force, social norms, job demands, personal criticism is pushing you to change or conform or just pretend to be something you're not. It's that self-possession required to simply show up and act according to your foundational self.
So the bravery isn't necessarily in fighting the external world. It's more in holding steady to the internal one. That requires a different kind of strength, doesn't it? A sort of persistent, quiet commitment. Like if the turkey is constantly wondering if it should lay, square eggs just because the chickens are getting more attention, that's where the failure starts.
Exactly. That's the point. And the really profound benefit of this self-possession, this kind of core bravery, is what the writer calls presence.
Ah, presence. The sources connect these concepts completely, don't they? We often confuse presence with, being loud or taking up a lot of space physically. But here they argue that if you have that foundational self-owned bravery, You actually don't need to strive to be noticed.
That's right. The source states it pretty clearly. Being you is presence. That is the announcement just by being.
Hmm.
Your authentic identity, it acts as its own signal, its own resonance. You don't really need to announce your arrival because, in a way, your truth walks into the room before you do. And this stands in really sharp contrast to those who try to, let's say, fake presence. If you're relying on fancy suits or loads of jargon or maybe aggressive posturing to signal how important you are, well, the reflection suggests that's often just compensating for a lack of that core identity. A person operating from true core bravery is present simply because of the constancy of their nature. You feel it.
Yeah, I can picture that. The person who has this core presence is probably someone you feel you can rely on, someone whose actions are predictable, maybe, not because they're boring, but because they're rooted in a really stable internal framework.
And that brings us neatly to the next crucial step in their argument: consistency. If this identity is true, it shouldn't just be reserved for special occasions, right? The reflection really stresses that authentic and purpose living shouldn't be a novelty or a joke. If it's truly who you are, it has to be the standard way you operate.
That makes sense in a professional context, too. We all know consistency is key to credibility. So if your core identity is only visible on, say, a Friday afternoon when you finally finish your big projects, but the rest of the week you're performing this stressed out, maybe disconnected version of yourself, well, then that performance is what the world actually receives.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that authenticity is simply just who you are day in and out. It's the daily rhythm. If you are a bird that lays eggs, you lay eggs regularly. You don't lay eggs for a week and then spend the next 3 months trying to learn how to fly like a bat because it looks cool. And it's this constancy, they argue, that actually achieves the extraordinary results. We often assume extraordinary results require some kind of extraordinary complexity or effort, but the notes argue something different. They say extraordinary results resonate with others precisely because of their truth, their reliability, and maybe their lack of pretense.
So it sounds like simple, relentless constancy generates results that only look extraordinary because they're so rare in a world filled with constantly shifting performances and personas.
Exactly. When you encounter that kind of reliable truth, it just cuts through the noise, doesn't it? It builds trust, which at the end of the day is the foundation of any real impact.
Okay, now let's pivot to the section that, for me, really elevates this reflection beyond just personal philosophy. It's the connection it makes between this idea of identity and organizational systems, specifically within the tech landscape.
Yeah.
That seems like a leap at first. Usually we try to solve systemic problems with better systems, right? New processes, new tools. Why does this reflection say that's maybe not enough?
Yeah, this is where the turkey analogy becomes like a lens for looking at organizational failure or maybe just friction. The writer makes a pretty striking, actionable observation here. They say the modern technology landscape is changing faster than ever. AI, new hardware, global shifts, everything. And yet the fundamental lack we're seeing, the instability, the repeated cycles of failed initiatives is, quote, not for sake of systems, but for the sake of identity.
Wow. Okay, so are you telling me that when a huge tech company goes through its third major internal reorg in like 18 months, or when a flagship product suffers from perpetual mission creep and feature fragmentation, the root cause isn't necessarily poor process design or bad management, but maybe a kind of philosophical identity crisis at its core?
That is precisely the implication, yes.
Yeah.
Think about a technology firm or even just a large development team. If the core identity, the turkey, let's say, of that entity is unclear, then everything it produces, the egg, is likely going to be flawed or inconsistent. For example, if a company's foundational identity is confused, like are we primarily a product company or are we a service company? Are we supposed to be innovative disruptors or are we stable infrastructure providers? If that's confused, that confusion manifests systemically. You end up with unstable APIs, maybe inconsistent user experiences, a product roadmap that constantly shifts, all because the internal self-definition is missing or it's in conflict. The system, no matter how optimized you try to make it, is struggling to support a non-existent or conflicting identity.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting for me because we so often default to thinking the solution is always a better agile framework or a more rigorous QA process or some new collaboration tool. We focus purely on the structure, the system itself. But if the source is correct, maybe the system is just mirroring the unresolved internal identity of the people or the organization building it.
It implies we're often trying to build a really stable roof on top of a shifting, uncertain foundation. Now, the writer does acknowledge that the answer can be twofold, meaning, yes, of course, you need functional systems. You can't just ignore process. But they stress that you have to start somewhere. And that starting place, they argue, must be the core identity. If the people running the organization, the ones designing the systems, are operating primarily from performance mode, trying to beat chicken when they're not,
Yes.
rather than operating from their core being, their turkey nature, then the systems they build will inevitably prioritize things like appearance, maybe complexity, temporary novelty, instead of prioritizing constancy and truth.
So the reason we sometimes see constant replatforming or these dramatic, maybe unnecessary pivots in strategy, it isn't always because the system's failed. It might be because the foundational leadership or perhaps the organizational culture itself lacks that core bravery to just say, look, this is who we are, this is what we build, and we will be consistent in that purpose.
It's arguably the highest leverage point you can find. Achieving constancy and presence, especially in a volatile technical landscape, seems to require an identity that is anchored, that allows the system to be resilient rather than just constantly reactive. If you know you are a bird that lays eggs, you focus on laying the best possible egg you can, regardless of how other birds are tweeting about their cool new flying strategies.
So the ultimate synthesis of this whole deep dive is actually pretty striking, isn't it? It seems the profound philosophical strength required for an individual to live authentically is the exact same foundation required for organizational stability and maybe even extraordinary results in some of the most complex, rapidly changing environments we have.
Absolutely. Yeah, the reflection brings us full circle, doesn't it? It reinforces that maybe simplicity is strength and that self-ownership is the ultimate prerequisite for making a real impact. The turkey laid the egg because it was a turkey. The equation is just elegant in its simplicity.
Okay, so after all that, what does this mean for you listening right now? If this reflection holds water, and if the most critical gap in our rapidly changing technology landscape, or maybe in any organizational structure really, is this lack of core identity, what fundamental assumption about structure, about process, about systems must we challenge the next time we face chaos or instability? If the solution must first come from who you are at your core being, where in your professional life or even your personal life are you currently trying to perform like a chicken when maybe your truest self is simply meant to be the turkey? Something to think about.